Um, yes, my name's Sean. I'm the Manager of Strategic Planning at Wellington City Council, and I'm joining you in the midst of putting a new district plan through the council, so entirely new city planning regulations. So it's quite a good time to talk about digital twins and governance, because this is why we build digital twins, is to do things like this. So I thought I'd introduce Wellington. So Wellington has had quite an interest in digital twins for the last 10 years. We're one of those strange places that developed a lot of the infrastructure and the precursors to digital twins without realizing that's what we were doing. And so the reason we did that is because Wellington is incredibly mountainous and it's right next to the sea. And what that means is two-dimensional maps are actually quite hard to use here because they don't tell you how easy it is to get from one place to another because of all the hills. The landscape also changes a great deal because of things like land reclamation and earthquakes, which move us around, literally. And so what we do is we've been developing digital twins to help us understand our city better and to help communicate that understanding and ultimately provision our democracy so we can make better decisions. And so an example of that dynamism is, if you look back a couple of hundred years, this is what Eastern Wellington looked like. It was an island not attached to the rest of the city. A very large earthquake happened and it was pushed up out of the sea. And then ever since, we've been reshaping that land as mana whenua. Our indigenous people, Māori, have built their settlements, as my people have built our settlements, and we've grown together. And as we stand today, we're now looking forward to new dynamic forces, things like climate change, changing ways of understanding how a capital relates to its nation, all sorts of things. And so this is what this digital infrastructure is designed to help us understand. It also helps people understand that cities are not static objects. They grow and they change, and infinite complexities. And sometimes it can be quite hard to work out just how much it's changing because you don't really notice it. And so a good example of how that time works is, Cleopatra in the middle there was born closer to the person landing on the moon than the building of the Great Pyramid, even though we probably associated more with the Great Pyramid than we would with Mr. Armstrong. Queen Victoria was born in the same. Queen Victoria was reigning when Nintendo was set up. It's fair to say she wasn't amused by it. And the fax machine was patented not very long after New Zealand began to be colonised. And the reason we raise this is because that relationship between technology and time and space is ultimately what planning is all about, what I do. And so that's what's driving that digital investment. And so what we're doing is understanding how all of these systems link together so that when we start to pull strings using different regulatory, economic, and incentive-based systems, we know roughly what's going to happen. We can predict what's going to happen, and we can advise councillors and our community about what the implications of doing that will be. And there are an enormous number of strings that we need to understand. We've got to understand how changes in coastal dynamics are going to affect long-term investment patterns in our city. We need to understand how Indigenous data sovereignty is helping shape our digital world, just as indigeneity is shaping our physical world. And what it means as we transition from New Zealand back to Aotearoa again, but a new Aotearoa. We need to understand what's beneath our feet, because one of the great unknowns in any city is precisely where the infrastructure is. We know where it should be, but I can tell you when you start to dig into the ground, it might not be where it is. We need to understand climate change. On the top right there is what the east coast of New Zealand looked like last year. The empty reservoir on the left is what it looked like the year before. And so we need to understand both swings of the pendulum, both what La Nina does and El Nino, and plan for both. And we need to figure out how to re-urbanize our cities so that we have space that we need, and ultimately provision our democracy as it makes the very long-term decisions that are needed to address these systemic issues. None of these things can be addressed by a single decision. They all take long chains of many across generations to work out. And so one of my favourite digital twin projects is a thing called TrackDem, which has been worked on in our Democratic Services Department, which allows you to see who voted for what, when, and how those decisions link together and how they affect a place. It sounds like a very simple thing to do, but I can assure you it's quite complex. But on to understanding digital twins. So this is some of our early work. We've got a habit of testing things to figure out how they work. It's based on the Harry Potter principle of never trust anything you can't see where it keeps its brain. And so one of those things is how we count birds. So each of these dots is the sound of a bird. It's been recorded up in Zealandia, what's called a mainland island. So it's a chunk of indigenous biodiversity that's been restored in the heart of our city. And what it's doing is counting the birds by the sounds they make using TensorFlow, telling me basically, is the city's investment resulting in us hearing more birds? The reason that's important is because we get more of these guys. These are kaka. There are now 8 species of birds that were extinct in Wellington that have been brought back from the brink. And some of the very rarest ones in the world can now be seen in our gardens. So as I sit here today, I've got saddlebacks. There are only 7,000 of them left in the world. You can either go to a remote island off New Zealand's coast, and believe me, New Zealand's pretty remote to begin with, or you can go to a suburb in the capital city and see them. And so what it means is we're one of the very few capital cities around the world where indigenous biodiversity is growing. And that digital infrastructure is really important. So understanding, for example, where all the trees are and how those trees provide services to us. They hold together our hillsides. They remove the need for investments in retaining walls. They are ultimately the backbone that supports that biodiversity. And they're how our community are involved in that biodiversity, making all of this happen. We also, of course, measure the buildings because just like birds need a place to live, so do we. And one of those things we do is measure what has been built where. How is the city growing? We've focused a great deal in our proposed district plan on how to create more housing, but there's more than just housing the city needs. We've also got to make space for work, for recreation, all those other things that are needed in a growing city. And because people walk down the street each day, it can be hard to associate change because it happens every day. But these digital systems help us become conscious of it. They help us also see the relationship between things like council investments in streets and facilities and development, because the development's not random. People do things for reasons, and this helps us see those reasons at scale and build better business cases and better decision making by being more conscious of what effects things have in our actual city. And so you can see that the rebuilding of Victoria Street in 2014-15 has resulted in a clustering of development after that period. Willis Street, if we went back another 10 years, you'd see a lot more orange on this map, showing how that street's attracted it, and same with the convention centre more recently. And so what these systems do is they build up our understanding of the city and help us become more conscious of what we do. So 2-dimensional decision making becomes 3-dimensional. So, for example, that's some of our new land zoning. One of the big innovations over this planning period has been people beginning to understand that land zoning is not painting colours on maps. They're 3-dimensional objects that the 3-dimensional objects we live and work in will fit inside. The location of services beneath the street has been a massive advancement. Now we can dig with a reasonable amount of confidence knowing what we're going to hit. Basically, we're using diggers to feel for gas pipes less and less, and we're building new cycleways throughout the city on the understanding that we geometrically need to move more people in the same amount of space. And so this is where these digital twins really come into their own, because they allow us to see invisible things like the future or those fleeting moments. And so, for example, in Waitoki, it's a combination of library, kindergarten, swimming pool, and community centre. Yes, all those things do work together. I was doubtful too. Having a digital copy of it before it was built, then fusing that digital copy to its reality has enabled all sorts of problems to be solved. Some of them, like understanding where the books go when people take them out. What is the catchment that building is serving? Understanding how people get there. One of the most interesting things was solving a potential dispute between staff, because for the first time in our history, lifeguards and librarians were going to have to share a lunchroom. And by putting them into it in VR before it was built, they could understand actually it's not going to be such a problem after all. All of these things become more possible with these digital twins. And over time, what we've discovered is that digital twins become less model-like and more market-like as they grow. So our city-based twins behave as markets, multiple organizations interacting through federated data systems for multiple outcomes, versus the model basis, which is more like what we see in our consenting systems, where a model of a building is created by a single party, controlled by a single party, and is vertically and horizontally integrated. And so what these market systems look like in practice is like what happens after an earthquake. So after an earthquake, when an earthquake happens in Wellington, sensors across the city, both in private buildings, public infrastructure, surge data towards our headquarters, fused together, pulled into those big three-dimensional models so that we can then make decisions quickly. It also means that we can start to work in parallel. So by using these digital systems, rather than having to pass building inspections physically across from, say, the inspectorate to the welfare desk to work out how we're going to look after people, to then the animal control officers to look after the animals, to the economic analysis, we can replicate it digitally. Everybody's looking at the same picture, and all of those decisions can then be made in parallel, which means because they're being made at the same time, they can factor each other. It drastically cuts the amount of time that it takes to respond to an earthquake. It saves the city and New Zealand millions of dollars and lost productivity from having to close things. And it allows decision makers to make decisions with far more certainty and, more importantly, communicate them. A good example is during an earthquake a couple of years ago, or last year, our CEO could use the sensor systems to rapidly work out that this isn't going to be such a problem. The buildings haven't endured that much force. Being able to make that kind of decision quickly is really important. It also shows you when governance works, because governance is ultimately about how you make decisions. And when the digital infrastructure is matching the governance infrastructure, then it will work. You go from having a toy to having a tool. These all fit within the wider family, the city-wide digital twin. So here's some screenshots from the one we operate each day. This is just being replaced at the moment. So as we've open sourced more and more of the technology. And what it allows us to do is to simulate new buildings, to understand things like how sunlight's going to work. We can look at, where was a bus at a particular time on a particular day, when we're looking at the circumstances that something has happened in, so that we can then better inform the planning for that circumstance in the future. And we continually find uses for it. What's also useful is it allows organisations to work together. Our city council doesn't run the bus system. The regional council does. And so by being able to federate those data systems between organisations means that we can gain value that we didn't have before. And we can create that infrastructure for collaboration where we can work out how we're going to get along together rather than working out how we're going to talk to each other. If you look beneath the road, that's probably the most interesting of the digital twin projects at the moment. There's been a very large pilot with a Wellington company called Reveal to find what is beneath the streets. Much of the infrastructure we knew was there, but it turns out it's not quite where we thought it was. And so what you've had is a big investment in the city's data. We've also found new stuff, and we found stuff we forgot about, things like old tram tracks. Now, all of this matters when it goes to opening the ground, because if you hit something you didn't know was there, you've got to change the plan. And the more you change the plan, the longer it takes. And the longer it takes, the more disruption it causes and the more cost it creates. And when you look at the renewal of our water pipes, which are pretty much all those linear assets you can see there, the resource consents, the replacement of earthquake-prone buildings, there's enormous amounts of work to take place in the city. And that's ultimately what these systems are forming, are these digital marketplaces where we can phase these works so that they have as little impact on people's lives as possible. We don't always get it right, and there are still things that slip through. But overall, the works are better coordinated now, particularly in the central city, than they've ever been. It also, what we're finding is the rate of return is enormous. So, investments in these areas that we've seen in England have resulted in about 12 times the expected rate of return. We've seen from our own work that we can often pay back the investment and lost productivity within a few weeks. And we can make things a lot safer. Not feeling for gas pipes with diggers means that we're confident that people are going to go home at the end of the day safe. And ultimately, we can put that into numbers, but in my view, making sure that people are confident their loved ones are going to be safe is probably more valuable than any dollar figure we can come up with. And one of the interesting things from a decision-making point of view is how do you create the business cases to invest in these things? One of the problems I find with no-brainers is that nobody really thinks about them. And when something benefits everybody, for some reason, nobody terribly wants to invest in it. So we've been very fortunate to attract government funding into this area, and also to put some of Council's own capability and some of our best officers onto the work. And what we've done is done it in 6 work streams. So there's the policy and processes, the data sharing, the mandating, the how are we going to deal with shared data versus open data, security, all that sort of stuff. There's the asset sharing data platform, which is what is it we're actually going to do? What are we going to do now? And what are we going to do later? And what is the long-term technological adaptation pathway, which also fits into work stream 6. There's the recognition that technology plus people equals change. And so if we can change the technology all we want, but if we don't change the people, it's not going to work. And so that's why there's been a large internal change program looking at how our legal processes work. How do we build things like data standards into our regulatory systems and our enforcement systems so that people must move from paper? How do we make those systems of value to both the person seeking the consent and the people granting the consent? Because what you don't want to do is start to create digital duplication where people make effectively digital paper to submit to us. We need to dip into existent data streams or invest in data streams that are going to be useful to multiple points along the process for everybody. There's been how do we engage nationally? We've been getting a lot of help from Bloomberg and Harvard University running a Tiger team on this with us, and working with the other big cities in New Zealand, and they're big for us, and also the government on how do we deal with the multi-jurisdictional nature of this? How do we work with the private sector and the different actors in the private sector, mindful of some of their IP requirements and how their value creation systems work? There's the integration. So we're not just trying to improve what happens under the ground, we're trying to improve what's on the surface. So it has to interact with the wider twin infrastructure. And then how do we ultimately create a sustainable market we can procure from in the long term? So workstream 6, which is the one that's, if you get this right, this becomes an enduring change. And so alongside this has also been what's happening on the surface. So the building of very large amounts of cycling infrastructure in some of New Zealand's busiest and most constrained road corridors. And the ability to simulate has become really valuable. So, for example, this is a simulation on a cycleway that was to be built. It has been built. It looks very like this. It meant we could iron out those problems digitally before we had to iron them out physically. It also meant we could explain things like the introduction of hook turns. I know that transport engineers have very good diagrams on hook turns, but I have trouble reading them, and if I have trouble reading them, other people will too. There's bound to be somebody like me somewhere. And what this means is we can communicate the same information multiple ways, and that helps us reach more people. It also means that you're not sitting in the middle of an intersection at some point on your bicycle trying to work out how to do a hook turn, which is quite valuable. But if we look at what we're facing into now, we've got more legal reform. The planning system was entirely reformed by the last government, and that reform was repealed, and so we're going to do it again. We've got the challenges of seismicity and how we're going to deal with earthquakes in the long term. We've got reurbanisation. What we're finding is intensifying the city is the right decision for climate change adaptation for all sorts of reasons. But it has relied on the assumption the infrastructure is already there to plug into. And what we've found is it's not. And what that means is we've got to rebuild the skeleton as the body grows. We're also having to navigate our own humanity as digital people. We serve a society, we serve in the context of that society, and that society manifests in the instructions we get through our democracy. And so understanding digital identities is incredibly important for the long term, because the relationship between citizenship and democracy is at the very core of what we do as a local government. We also find that in quantifying those challenges over time, these digital twins start to perform a memory. So this is one of those diagrams I think only I can really read, but all of these buildings that have pins in them were originally earthquake prone. The purple ones are heritage buildings. The grey ones are no longer earthquake prone, they've been strengthened. The red ones are still problems. What's really interesting about this is very few people in Wellington know how many buildings have been strengthened, because we tend to focus on the problems as opposed to what's been done about them. And so understanding and having that memory over time becomes quite important, because I don't know about you, but I've become quite disheartened if we make no progress about something. So I need to know something's changing. But if you look at what we're doing, the only other thing I haven't mentioned is the climate adaptation twin, which is led by my colleague Julia McMaster, and she's working with Bloomberg Philanthropies and cities around the world to use game engines to simulate climate change and provision this long-term decision making. It's a really cool project. We're going to see a lot more of it in the next year. In this year. If you look at how we classify innovation, we sort of do it on this diamond. It's from OPSI, which is the OECD's policy arm. And what you see is us doing mission-oriented stuff. So the big strategic things like climate change. There's adaptive innovation where we do things better. The bottom-up stuff. That's things like better ways of reporting damage for citizens to infrastructure each day. There's anticipatory innovation. That's the experimentation stuff, like leaning into machine learning and testing it to understand how the ethics behind it work in a real street with real people in a real city. And then there's the enhancement-oriented innovation, which is you see an opportunity and you grab it. So, for example, for us, we have incredibly extreme winds. So we have a unique opportunity to understand wind, and that becomes an advantage for the city in doing this kind of work, oddly enough. But I think I've spoken for long enough. I'll pass back over and I'll stop sharing so I can see you all again.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. I'm going to let our go over for just another couple of minutes because you did start late and I've left quite a long break. I'm going to ask people to put their hand up if they want to ask a question, but I'll pass over to you, Arthur, first.
Yeah, thank you. Sean, that was very cool. And Wellington's one of my favorite cities, except to land in. It's not fun to an airplane.
That's the wind factor.
Yeah, no, it'd be easy to land sideways sometimes.
Yeah, they do indeed. I landed there and the plane in front of me touched on the way down, so it was pretty exciting. I had a question about, so that you showed it early on, you showed a dam and then you showed it flooded, we showed it flooded and you showed it dried. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't turn on the video. Just one moment. So my question was, do you partially answered it later on. I'm not sure if you completely answered, but do you also use the digital twin to predict catastrophic or creeping environmental effects?
So yes, we do. So what we do is we basically simulate what different types of rainfall will do, those sorts of things. The key thing it's helping us do is sort of expose the digital edge of the city's built environment to the digital edge of the climate change modelling, so that climate change modelers and the CRIs can better advise us of things. Because one of the big problems we have is climate is probably the most complex natural system that we're trying to understand versus which are probably the most complex built environment. And you've got two groups of people who engage with incredible complexity, but it's quite hard for them to engage with each other.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that it's helping us with is, at the moment there's a big discussion about sponge cities and the need to absorb water because the last events were flooding events on the East Coast. But, you've got to be careful how you design that, because if it becomes a source of dust in a dry event, you've only planned for half the event. And so sometimes these digital simulations are useful to tap people on the shoulder and go, yes, but you need to do this too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The correlation effect. You also use IoT devices with your twin?
We do. Julia's the expert in that. She's just rolling out a very large pedestrian and cyclist multimodal counting system. The most interesting part of the IoT systems from my point of view is the privacy governance, and how things like our privacy impact systems have mandated things like remote processing or edge processing and those sorts of technologies to be built in as a response. So we don't really measure anything that somebody else in the world isn't measuring. I think what's interesting is more the how we've quite consciously developed the privacy infrastructure around it necessary to keep doing it.